Welcome back to our one wild and precious lives and our dogs. Today's episode is a spin-off of something that came up in the second episode that I did together with Peter. We talked about our dogs, and among other things, Peter mentioned that both his dogs, Leo and Cleo, were not very interested in food. This inspired me to record this particularly dog nerdy episode about reinforcers. Okay, let's back up a little. Reinforcers. What is a reinforcer? A reinforcer is what most people would probably call a reward. So in dog training, it could be, for example, the cookie that you give to your dog for a job well done. The reason I prefer the word reinforcer is that reinforcer is a scientific term with a specific and clear definition, while reward is just a word. It does not have an agreed upon definition. The scientific definition of a reinforcer is that it's the consequence for a behavior which increases the likelihood of that behavior happening again in the future or maintains the likelihood of that behavior happening again. In plain English, a reinforcer, and in our case we're specifically talking about positive reinforcers, is something like a treat. For example, let's say your dog sits and you give them a cookie, and the dog really enjoys the cookie, and now the likelihood increases that in the future the dog will sit again. That's the definition of a reinforcer. And an example of something that is not a reinforcer is exactly something that came up in episode 2. Peter shared a funny story about Leo. When he and Leo went to an Italian bistro in Antigua, Guatemala, the owner of the bistro was really proud of their meat products, and they offered Leo a slice of this wonderful, freshly cut, some sort of ham, something really delicious. Leo had sat and he accepted the ham, and then he spat it right out. So in this case, ham is not a reinforcer for Leo. The reason is that whether something is a reinforcer is always determined by the learner, not by the teacher. We as humans, we may assume that the ham has to be a reinforcer because we personally liked it, or the dog we had in our childhood liked it. But it's not. It's only a reinforcer if it increases the likelihood of the behavior we fed after in the future. And that, of course, hinges on the dog actually liking whatever we are offering them. So if Leo spits out the ham is not a reinforcer for Leo. Versus if your dog takes the cookie after sitting, that cookie is a reinforcer for your dog, assuming that sitting gets more and more probable in the future or just stays as strong as it has been. All right, we also talked in that episode about some dogs having a lot of food motivation and others having less food motivation. This is a really interesting topic to me, especially right now, because it seems to keep coming up. Both Leo and Cleo, Peter's dogs, are not strongly motivated to work for food. And also various dogs in the class I'm currently teaching at Fenzi Dog Sports Academy. It's called May the Reinforce Be With You, and it's all about reinforcers. Several of the dogs in this class are started out also not being super interested in food. And their owners, their people tend to say, oh, my dog is not food motivated. There's something interesting about this sentence because it can only be true to a certain extent. Food is a primary reinforcer. So is water, so is oxygen. Everything we need in order to survive is a primary reinforcer. If we're alive today, we are to some degree food motivated, because if we were not eating, we wouldn't be alive anymore. If we call an organism not food motivated, that is always relative. So what does that mean? And if food is a primary reinforcer, how is it possible that dogs like Leo will just prefer social reinforcers or social feedback, like Peter telling Leo that he's awesome and maybe petting him or playing with him? Why would Leo prefer that over a beautiful piece of ham? Well, there's several reasons a dog may not be all that into food when you're trying to train something. This is what my class I'm currently teaching, by the way, is all about. It explores this topic. By the time this episode airs, the class is gonna be over, but it usually runs once a year, so if you just wait a couple months, it'll come around again. You can also, if you want to join my next class at FDSA, which starts on August 1st, it's about recalls, but among other things, we also really explore the topic of food and food motivation in depth. Anyways, so all dogs and all animals are food motivated to some extent because they need to eat in order to survive. In my example that I used in episode 2, I talked about my dog Game, my Malinois, who is very food motivated, and I said that I just generally use kibble to reinforce her, and she will take this in most situations without issues. Kibble tends to be a relatively low value food. That's because it's dry and it's the same every day all the time, so it's relatively boring. And there are many dogs who are not into kibble as a training reward. They may be eating their kibble when it's free and comes out of their food bowl, or they may enjoy their kibble when it's in a puzzle toy. But if you're working on a complicated behavior or an expensive behavior, like say you're teaching precision healing and the dog is not a particularly biddable individual, they might take a piece of kibble or two and then just stop eating it because it's just not worth the effort. So there are a couple solutions to this. I don't think Peter has that problem with Cleo or Leo because he's someone who can build really strong relationships with his dogs, and he will find something that works for them if he needs to or wants to reinforce them. However, among my students who are training for specific sports or who have dogs with major reactivity problems, it is often really useful to have a dog who will eat in most situations. Because one, you can use food, for example, in the form of a scatter. You can scatter a bunch of treats on the floor, on the ground, or in the grass. And when your dog sniffs for that food, they need to use their nose in a certain way. And the way they're breathing when they're sniffing and smelling something rather than just breathing has a calming effect. So this comes in really handy if they're about to go over threshold, if they're about to explode, if they're really, really high. And also for many sports, it is very useful to have to be able to use food as a reinforcer simply because food is usually available and it's very easy to use. There are lots of other reinforcers, so you can train an animal without ever using food. But food is the easiest to use, and you can usually have it on you. And also, you don't have to think about how to end the reward or reinforcement process. Because you give the dog the treat, the dog consumes the treat, and the treat is gone. So now you're already setting up for your next rep, which you can then pay with the next treat. This is different, for example, with something as simple as a toy, which is also a common reinforcer for many dogs, because the toy does not disappear. So after playing with your dog, so you're using the toy to reinforce the behavior you liked in your dog. For example, the dog sat, you threw a ball for them, but now you need to get the ball back. This makes the entire reinforcement process more complex than if it had been a treat. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is how you can use, so if you have a dog who eats their food out of a bowl, but maybe they're not interested in food or not particularly, they don't give you the enthusiasm you're looking for in training when you use kibble, for example. There are a couple factors you can change. You can change the amount of kibble you feed at a time. Dogs they have numeric competence. That means they know whether they're getting a very small amount of something or a big amount of something. And even if the food itself, say the kibble, is relatively low value for them, if you up the amount, it just feels like it's more. It's like you have a penny that's relatively low value, but if you have I don't know, let's say an entire bucket full of pennies or 2 buckets or 3 buckets, the value changes. It's worth more now because it's more pennies. Also, if you want to feed kibble, you could store it in a container in your fridge overnight together with some chicken. Then the kibble gets a little softer and moister and it starts tasting like chicken. That tends to up the value as well. Another thing you could do is you could feed your dog only once a day instead of twice a day. So you feed them their dinner, but no breakfast. That way, like throughout the day, there may be moments where your dog, who is used to having 2 meals a day, is just feeling a little bit hungry. Feeding an adult dog who's healthy once a day is totally fine, no problem there. So you can measure out their meal for the day in the morning and then use it throughout the day, and the dog won't be full from breakfast when you're training with that kibble. One more life hack or training hack is if you are currently feeding a low energy dense kibble, that means that your dog has to eat a lot of kibble in order to get their nutritional needs met and to hold their weight. You could switch to a high energy dense kibble. High energy dense kibble contains more nutritional value in a smaller volume. So you'd feed them less, but they would still be able to hold their weight and they would still get all their nutritional needs met. The advantage of using high energy dense kibble, it doesn't fill the stomach up as easily as low energy dense kibble, so there will be less food. The volume of food in their stomach will be smaller simply because they don't have to eat as much. That tends to lead to less of a feeling of satiation, which may also up your dog's food drive. And one last thing is that many pet dogs, and probably some sport dogs, are overweight. You may not be aware of it. Your vet may not have pointed it out to you. They are likely aware of it, I hope, but they may not want to say something because it may be more important to them to keep you as a client than to get your dog to lose a couple pounds. If it's not if they're not morbidly obese, the vet may just not say anything. However, many dogs I see around me are overweight and their owners don't know that. That's because nobody has ever taught them how to tell whether a dog has healthy weight or is a little bit chubby. And also, there's a range of normal weight. There's athletic weight and then there's pet dog weight. Pet dog weight is what I call the heavier end of normal, and athletic weight is what I call the lighter end of normal. I always keep my dog at athletic weight. That means you should easily be able to feel their ribs without feeling like there's a big layer of fat covering them. In breeds with very thin, short hair, like for example greyhounds, you may even be able to see the ribs. And yeah, you will definitely be able to see their waist. If you can't easily feel the ribs, or if you can't tell where their waist is, your dog could likely lose a few pounds. And you can ask your vet directly about that. That may help them be more direct with you. If you keep your dog on the leaner end of normal, their food motivation also tends to go up. That's simply because the dog that's on the heavier end of normal never feels hungry. There's just always food around before they even have a chance to get hungry. The next meal rolls around. But the dog on the leaner end of normal will occasionally feel like eating something. We're not starving that dog. It's still a dog who's getting all their nutritional needs met. It's not like they're feeling sick because they haven't eaten in days. It's just that they have the opportunity to experience the feeling of being a little bit hungry every now and then, which I don't think is an unhealthy or bad experience at all. Oh yeah, another thing to avoid is free feeding. So don't leave the food out all day for your dog to choose when to eat, even if they are at a healthy weight. Leave no food out during the day. Feed them once or twice a day and give them a window of time to finish their meal and pick up whatever they haven't eaten by the end of that window of time. If they're used to grazing all day, that will change as they learn that there's this window of time to finish their meals. Again, this helps them occasionally throughout the day experience a little bit of hunger, and that will make them more food motivated. If you have a dog who just seems to be super picky about food, I love recommending Sue Ailsby's protocol for teaching dogs to eat. I'll link to it in the show notes. Finally, there are certain red flag behaviors that are rare, but they do happen, and they are a reason to consult your vet. That is, if your dog is of normal or even athletic weight, but you still have to keep changing their diet in order for them to eat at all. They may be eating the same food for a while and then suddenly start refusing it. So you change the kind of food, and again, they'll be eating it for a week or 2 or 3. And then they start refusing it. So you change foods again, and they will eat for a few weeks, and then they'll stop eating that food. Also, if you have a dog who you have to, you kind of have to hand feed every piece of kibble or every spoonful of a home cooked meal or a raw meal or canned dog food to them. Otherwise, they just won't eat and they will lose weight. That is not normal, and that means you should go to you should see a vet and potentially an internal specialist, an internal medicine specialist. And then, of course, now let's assume you don't want to use kibble, or all the kibble hacks just don't work for your dog. Well, that makes perfect sense. I also don't want to work for, I don't know, rice crackers. That's very boring. I want something more exciting if I am getting rewarded for a difficult behavior. So you may just want to use something other than kibble altogether, if even kibble and chicken doesn't do the trick. And here I usually use human foods. If you're located in the US, you probably have a large selection of tasty dog treats to choose from. Where I am in the world, there just isn't a ton of good options available. And the ones that are available are more expensive than human food, so I just tend to avoid them. And as for human food, as long as you're using it in small amounts, it really doesn't matter what it is, as long as your dog likes it and doesn't get sick from it. And healthy dogs, like my dog Game, for example, when I work on a new or really difficult behavior, I tend to change from kibble to a higher value treat. And a higher value treat for her could be cheese, it could be hot dog slices, it could be chicken. Really anything human that's made for humans, she usually likes it. It doesn't have to be big. If it's high value, usually a small piece of it is usually sufficient to motivate the dog. If there's also like a bunch of things you could try, for example, moist food is especially good on hot days. Dry food tends to get lower and lower in value the hotter your dog gets. If it's really warm where you are and where you're training, use moist pieces of chicken, for example, or even use something in a squeeze tube. You can get these camping tubes at REI. They're pretty good for that. And then you can fill it with whatever your dog likes. It could be human baby food. Some dogs even like the ones that are just made of fruit. Others like the meat-based ones. Or you can use yogurt or maybe canned dog food. If you need to dilute it a little bit to get it out easier, you just add a little bit of water and mix it up, or you add yogurt and mix it up. In Austria and in Germany and probably in many parts of Europe, there are also usually in the pet food aisle of the supermarket these liver pate tubes. They are really popular among many dogs. They look like a toothpaste tube and you squeeze it and liver pate will come out. If wherever you live that's not available, just go to the deli counter and you will usually find some sort of salmon pate or something along these lines, which also comes in a tube that looks like a toothpaste tube and tends to be very popular with dogs. Yeah, I think for the moment that's all I have to say about food reinforcers. Do you absolutely need them? No. Are they convenient to use? Yes, absolutely. But also, if none of these work for you, or if you choose that you'd rather work with something that isn't food related, I'll be doing another nerdy dog training episode on reinforcers other than food, such as toys or environmental reinforcers. All right, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for listening.